We have one more presentation in our morning block here, and I'm glad to see our next speaker is here in the room with us. I was looking at her Twitter feed last night, and there were lots of pictures of sitting on a beach in Puerto Rico. And I thought, I'll be interested to see if she's with us on Wednesday morning. In government, academia, and journalism, Juliette Kayyem has served as a national leader in America's homeland security efforts. She's been described as a rising star of the Democratic Party, and in this latest election cycle, Kayyem was a candidate for governor of Massachusetts. She spent over 15 years in state and federal government, most recently as President Obama's Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security. There she played a key role in handling of the H1N1 pandemic and the BP oil spill response. Before that, she was Governor Patrick's Homeland Security Advisor, a member of the National Commission on Terrorism, and a legal advisor to U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno. She's received many government honors, including the Distinguished Public Service Award, which is the Coast Guard's highest medal awarded to a civilian. Kayyem's on the faculty at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and she's also spent considerable time in journalism, both with the Boston Globe and as an analyst for CNN. Last year, she was named the Pulitzer Prize finalist for her series of columns in the Globe, urging the Pentagon to end its female combat exclusion rule, which is a prohibition the military has since lifted in recognition of women's contribution to war efforts. To discuss reclaiming our security in an age of mayhem, please welcome Juliette Kayyem.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Scott. Nice to meet you. Thanks. Okay, they claim that, oh yeah, it's right here. Let me do this. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I am gonna, let me just make sure. Yep, okay. It is great to be here, and I want to tell you about my work, because we don't talk about it enough. And I'm going to begin with a story. Karen, my cousin, is a little older than me, with daughters who are already out of college. She is a dentist, and she has, over the years, scolded me, then aided me with my deteriorating gum situation caused by barely flossing, stress, and 4 cups of coffee a day. The email she sent me a few years back had a simple enough subject line: Al-Qaeda. Hi, Juliette, she wrote as a brief introduction to me, but the real reason was about her daughter. I'm a little nervous now, she said. She wrote, can you help? Debbie is in Pennsylvania, and she wants to go to New York City for the weekend. But I just saw that there might be an attack at the 10-year anniversary of 9/11, so I don't want her to go there. Would you send your kids? Am I crazy? By the way, how are your gums? Are you flossing? Don't forget to sleep with your night guard, and let me know about the terrorists. Dental care and bin Laden. Never before have the two been so closely aligned, but there was something illuminating in what Karen's questioned. She had made clear what was missing so much from the nation's security efforts, and perfectly nailed what I found so frustrating after so many years in the midst of it all, about protecting the homeland. People like Karen just wanted to be spoken to directly and plainly. They just want to be let in. Karen's email had one basic and simple request. Tell me about scary things, about what I should know, how it all works, and how I should behave, just like I would tell you about your gums. It was a simple request. Tell me about my homeland. And maybe the best way to do that is to tell you about my home. I have 3 children whose birth years mark moments in a decade of disaster. A few weeks before 9/11, my first child, Cecilia, was born. Leo entered the world as we went to war in Iraq in 2003. I was suffering from exhaustion in my last weeks of pregnancy with Jeremiah as the levees broke in New Orleans in 2005. But during these same years, I have served in the highest levels of state and federal government in homeland and national security for 1 governor, Deval Patrick, and 2 presidents, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. I have had to authorize sending troops abroad and am still an expert in the game Battleship. I've traveled the world and to Costco in Waltham. I have spent time in the Situation Room and the Children's Hospital emergency room after Leo used his younger brother's head as a baseball. I have been part of the efforts to manage the distribution of the H1N1 vaccine to the nation, but could not get my kids to the front of that line. I have been cleansed in post-radiation exposure shower after leaving a nuclear facility when my numbers suggested I had been contaminated. While disturbing, I found getting lice out of all of my children's hair after one unfortunate sleepover much, much worse. I've balanced being a mother and being the security expert in my family. It's not a particularly practical expertise compared to, say, fixing computer glitches or making fresh bread, but it comes in handy in an age when people are worried about all manners of mayhem. Indeed, if anything is consistent in the 15 years I have been in this field, it is this. Every day, without fail, I get an email or a phone call from my sister or a friend or a cousin or a friend's cousin or the cousin's friends, and they come down to one question: am I safe? That question was the focus of my career. How do I keep you safe? How do I keep the marathon safe, the transit system safe, the victims of a natural disaster safe? In addition to keeping people safe, the job of anyone in Homeland Security is a constant juggling act. How do I balance that safety with freedom, the risk with the reward? It's constant calculation of what is an acceptable level of vulnerability. And sometimes I have wanted to answer that question with the most honest answer. Why are you asking me? This isn't my burden alone to bear. But I understand why. You see, following 9/11, we, this band of Homeland Security counterterrorism experts, somehow convinced the American public that we can manage your security. We neglected to educate citizens, to build the habits found in nearly every home. The result was to make us more vulnerable, not less. And we did so with little impact or little thought of the long-term impact of such a strategy. But it was a strategy. The government's war on terror, which I was a part of, has been described by so many slogans. Remember these? Mission accomplished, the surge, red, orange, yellow, green, purple, hazy alert. Bin Laden is dead. But none have been so damaging as the two words first uttered in just the days after 9/11 and repeated to defend policies as far-ranging as the war in Iraq to the Patriot Act. Never again. Never again. If we didn't know it then, it is so simplistic and it is absurd. It is as vague as it is damaging. No two words have provided so little meaning to all of you, so little context. No catchphrase has so warped our policy discussions that it has permanently confused the public's understanding of Homeland Security. It convinced all of you that invulnerability was a possibility. Why? The reason is simple. Homeland Security is as much about the homeland as it is about security. And the United States homeland is really like no other. A federal structure with 50 governors, all kings and queens unto themselves, hundreds of cities with transit systems that only function when on time, vast commercial activity, crisscrossing borders, and respect, of course, sometimes nodding for civil rights and civil liberties. The ceaseless flow of people and goods taken as a God-given right to us all. And oh yes, the distribution of public money in an economic downturn to not only bolster security efforts, but schools, healthcare, transportation, and every other large and small concern that people care about. In this homeland, our homeland, never again was not ever going to be a possibility. And if never again was too simplistic, it was also too myopic. Never again what? By 2005, a nation that had so focused on protecting ourselves from terrorism essentially managed to not be able to save a city from drowning. Never again also seemed to justify any purchase or investment that could be made under the T for terrorism budget line item. Landlocked jurisdictions were purchasing boats, Homeland Security funds being spent on air conditioning and trash trucks, the kind of military-style weaponry we saw in Ferguson. The normal policy discussions that usually occur about investments, does the program work, is it necessary, were impossible to have when the only goal was never, ever, ever, ever again. But still, for all of its flaws, the worst aspect of never again was that it let the experts run the show. The never again mythology absolved citizens of all responsibility for their own security. Of course, after 9/11, we were so angry, so convinced that our future invincibility was a measure of our greatness, that no countervailing theory really stood a chance against never again. What the experts were promising, what I was promising, was what we desperately wanted to believe in. And then, as the fatigue from the war on terror set in and those mistakes were made, a counter-narrative began to form in 2005 and 2006. Remember her? Yeah. Keep calm and carry on. Right, that should work. If we all just did a lot of yoga, we would be fine. The mantra is presumed to represent the British sentiment during World War II, in part for standing in stark contrast to America's efforts. Its ever-increasing popularity was partially measured in what it started to appear from cooking aprons to a popular iPhone case, and its somber, sometimes witty variants that you're reading there. Tellingly, the keep calm part remained unchanged. But let me tell you something. The keep calm mantra was also a lie. So here's the real story. The phrase was commissioned in 1939 by Winston Churchill, of course, as part of his war effort. Over 1 million copies of the Keep Calm and Carry On sign were printed, but never distributed. No one knew about them until 2000. This man, Stuart Manley, a bookseller from England, brought the posters to light. They were in some boxes in his back room. It was unfamiliar but witty, so he put up a copy in his bookstore, and sales started to trickle in. In 2005, a newspaper covered the find, and before he knew it, Manley said, all hell broke loose. Never distributed. I have a theory as to why the posters moldered for decades. I think that those charged with ensuring the survival of Britain in the face of war knew that the motto, keep calm and carry on, was not what the Britons actually needed. Safety is not calm, and Brits understood this. They focused on policies that were geared towards maintaining a functioning society despite aerial attacks. Churchill needed Londoners to engage and sacrifice to keep the engines of commerce moving. Their resiliency didn't rest on a public relations campaign. It was a war effort as carefully constructed as any battle. So if we can't keep calm or count on America becoming an invulnerable fortress where nothing will ever happen again, what are we supposed to do? And after I left government, I realized that all my experiences has taught me one thing, a lesson I learned from being a mother, a wife, a citizen, and a public servant. So, my parents are here. Stuff happens. It's liberating. It really is. A citizenry that accepts those two words as a fact can now begin to take charge of their own security for themselves and their families. Homeland security is ultimately about risk reduction, whether it comes from climate change to brothers at a marathon or Ebola from West Africa. Yes, there are things our society must do to alleviate the risk, reduce carbon emissions, push for gun control, invest in a stronger healthcare system. But there are things that you can do too at home to ready yourselves to bounce back faster and wiser for when, not if, something happens. In more learned company, stuff happens is actually known as resiliency, though I prefer the term grip. It's more active, more in your face. It says, we got this, you got this, grip. True grip lies somewhere in between keep calm and never again, between chilling and fighting, between yoga and combat. The word resilient actually has its Latin roots are illustrative here. Re meaning back, but silient meaning jumping. It's not passive. Literally, the capability to jump back. It's a unique combination of determination and the ability to get yourself up and not look back after an incident. Our safety rests on policies in various stages of implementation and several that need to be implemented to fortress our resiliency. But our grip cannot rest on these policies alone. The experts, including myself, used to think so. Actually, it belongs with you. I recognize this now only because I have spent that career in the terror and disaster management trade, or as my husband likes to say, my disastrous career. My experience as an expert made me realize just how little the government prepared Americans or explained to them how you could become more resilient, making the nation more resilient in turn. No government ought to guarantee perfect security because no government can actually provide it. I'm not saying we can or should forgo preventative or defensive measures, but if that's all we've got, we are in trouble. Keeping calm is not enough in a world of lone wolf terrorists, cyber attacks from anonymous sources, and viral outbreaks. Never again can't help when global warming inevitably strikes us again. What can help is when we are focused our efforts on bouncing back after these things occur. So how do societies actually implement resiliency? Because we just tend to throw the word out there. How do we bounce back? Well, actually, it is built on 5 foundations. First, systems have redundancies and spare capacity. Just think, this is easy to think about, right? Most hospitals have backup generator systems. You don't put all your eggs in one basket. Second, they are flexible, adapting in the face of disaster. They are simply not tied to the status quo. A medical facility public health tent reserved for exhausted runners after a marathon can turn into an emergency room triage center for the 25,000 runners in the Boston Marathon after the terrorist attacks. Third, systems are built fail-safe. This is one of my favorite ones. So should they occur, the entire system doesn't go down. Super Bowl 2013, you all saw half the Super Bowl in dark. I, being the person I am, saw the other half in light. The electrical grid there was built in a way that any stress on the system would only take half of it out. As I can attest, annoyed sports fans are far, far more preferable to citizens panicking in darkness. Fourth, they can rapidly rebound. Such communities, meaning that disruptions are limited in time and scope. Hurricane Sandy is evidence of this phenomenon. The flooded metropolitan transit system was up and running within a week because of a series of structural fixes that had been put into place after previous floods. They learned how to rapidly rebound. And this gets to the last point. That's kind of wonkish, but if you look, evaluating, taking corrective action. Finally, these societies have the capacity to learn from the past. This is often called the feedback loop of misery in Homeland Security. Something bad will happen, but if we can learn, then the next time stuff happens, we will perform better, and each time that happens, citizens are less likely to feel completely disrupted or traumatized. Disasters, of course, bring their own sort of havoc, but if the havoc can be minimized because we are better at what we do, then the nation can move on quickly and then brace for the next time, because there will be a next time. So does this all sound familiar? It should. The disaster response that most succeeds depends on citizens seeing the similarities between their roles at home and in the homeland. To date, every level of government has done a lousy job of teaching that lesson. And for that, I admit a degree of blame. But I'm making it personal, and I'm challenging you to as well. So let me ask a few questions. How many of you have 24 hours of sufficient goods in your home to satisfy your family for 24 hours? Pretty good. 48. 72. Okay, we tend to think it's 72 on you. That's kind of scary, but that's sort of the disaster. 72 on you. 80% of Americans think that help will arrive within 2 hours of a call to 911. It won't. How many of you have copies of passports and/or birth certificates, social security cards, those papers? Okay, for you smart asses, how many of those copies are sitting with the original? Right. Not a good idea. Mail it out of state. How many of you have contingency plans for getting back home should systems of transportation fail? It gets harder now. Take a few moments to think about it. How many of those plans work when your phones are out? Yeah. How many of your kids know them? Your spouse or your partner. For those of you who have guns, do you have a safety lock at home? How many of you have gotten the flu shots? Please, everyone, please, please, please. I have a theory that you're not allowed to complain or worry about Ebola until you get your flu shot. Why do I ask these questions? So one is purely practical. The more you take your own responsibility, that of your children, your elderly parents, whoever, the less you will depend on the Homeland Security apparatus. And then we can reserve those precious resources for those really in need, those at ground zero, the infirm, the disabled, children. But more importantly, Because the more you take on your own responsibility, spare capacity, planning for the contingencies at home, flexibility, the backup plans, the fail-safe systems, for the contingencies that are likely to face you as a parent or an employer or a city planner or a mayor or a governor, then the less you will be asking the question, am I safe? You will own that answer. You got this, right? You got this. Because there will be a next time. Did I mention stuff happens? And I think that's it. Thank you very much. How'd I do on time?
Thank you, Juliette. That was great. You know, my one question for you is, I don't know if you've observed this about the world of government and the world of journalism, is that they're so driven by, you know, what are the fires we have to fight today? How do we apply our resources to something that's happening or going to happen today, Wednesday? How do you build more long-term thinking in government?
So part of it is that it's starting to happen. And I think that is because of this realization that we sort of had sold the American public a bill of goods, the never again. And that just after every single thing happens, people's expectation is, how did that happen? When people in government knows that's exactly what happened. So just a few bureaucratic changes that have occurred, and it matters that the Department of Homeland Security now actually has, this sounds wonkish, but it matters, has a resiliency directorate. Why does that matter? Because then there are a number of people and agencies and money going to thinking about how do we build stronger. That goes to climate change, to public health systems, but also to personal preparedness, which is essentially the foundation. But it is difficult. I mean, I've been critical of the Ebola response because in government, it's really hard to tell people that something bad's going to happen. I cannot believe, personally, that the CDC, that we didn't imagine that people would come here with Ebola. Like, it's just, it's absolutely predictable. There's 1 million people in the air at any given moment. It was absolutely predictable. So part of it is just over time beginning to realize that resiliency is part of response. And the other is to engage people, which we absolutely failed to do, and that really did not start to take hold. There's a great line that says, after 9/11, we tended to treat the American public as either terrorists or victims, and there was nothing in between. And so part of this is trying to engage all of you into the simple steps that would make you safer, so that, that one, you're not totally dependent on government, which is always a good thing, but secondly, so that you have some sense of your own risk.
Do you think, you kind of got me thinking when you talked about, 1 million people in the air at any one time, we're starting to see sort of thinking about, well, maybe there are particular airports that people from in affected countries may fly into. And it struck me that, when you travel, we still are kind of trying to secure against the last threat, right? Not a biological threat, but some kind of chemical explosive threat that's in my shoes or is in my laptop or whatever. So do you see that changing in terms of,
And I think, part of it is the sustainability of having a global economy with so many disruptions is almost impossible. And so part of this is, and also technology has helped in terms of getting our systems moving a lot faster. But one of the most famous stories, so I try not to be partisan in this talk, because I think that the realization of the failures of Never Again actually became clear within a month of 9/11. So one of the famous stories coming out of the Bush administration was Tom Ridge, who ultimately became Secretary of Homeland Security a month after 9/11. And a lot of us who are Democrats tend to think of Bush as, oh, he was so hardcore and everything, which he was. But he takes Ridge aside a month after and says, I just got a phone call from the President of Mexico and the Prime Minister of Canada. Something's got to give. And Ridge looks at him and says, what do you mean? And he goes, we have to find a better way to the borders, because remember, we had essentially closed off the borders after 9/11. We cannot sustain our economy or our trade with our two biggest trading partners with a system like this, right? The homeland could not function. You and I could not order on Amazon and get our delivery the next day. And This was a month after 9/11, and that was when there started to be changes to the northern and southern border routes. So, you know, part of this is just, I think the push of globalization will make security leaner, smarter, maybe more technologically savvy than the sort of brutal security in some ways that we saw immediately after 9/11.
Yeah, yeah. And it strikes me that the phrase never again is always kind of looking backwards,
Yeah.
right? It's not saying what's next, what's the next threat we should worry about, as
Right.
opposed to still worrying about the shoe bomber. You know, you need to worry about a biological threat or
Right.
some other kind of threat.
I mean, this is like, you know, as I say, 1 million people in the air. It's going to, you know, in 4 hours, that will be a different million people. Someone did the numbers once, but it's a lot. And, you know, on December 25th of 2009, I think it was, you know, I'm home, it's Christmas. I didn't have my classified phone because, of course, terrorists take Christmas off, right? Especially Muslim terrorists. And I'm not even thinking. And, of course, we have the attack. And, you know, part of it is, how could this happen? But then part of you are thinking, how does this not happen more often? That some just random guy who thinks he has some vision of the world and his role in it sticks something in his pants and tries to blow it up. I mean, and so if you get a sort of stuff happens attitude, then you begin to think about ways in which we can protect ourselves. No small irony that the person who protected everyone on the plane was, of course, another passenger.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for
Thank
returning from the
you.
tropics today.
Oh, thank you.